Hey, welcome everybody to another edition of Faith Greater Than Fear. It's an opportunity for us to talk to followers of Jesus who are having great intersections of life where their faith is making huge impacts in a time when people are wringing their hands and there's a lot of fear and hopelessness and discontentedness and asking the why questions. And so we do that with people locally and nationally and around the world sometimes. Today, I've got a dear friend. He's been a mentor of mine. He's helped us here at GNPI here in Joplin, kind of putting the ship in a special orbit, Frank. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Frank Preston. Frank, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Great. For all our listeners, we need to state the obvious. You may see a sling on his arm, and he's actually not supposed to be talking to us today. He's supposed to be convalescing because you just had rotator cuff surgery, and sounds like it went relatively well, and we sure will be praying for continued healing there. You're doing all right?
I'm doing fine. It's doing better than expected. So I got one more shoulder left to do. I tore the S one all the way. So both of them will have to be done.
Well, hopefully they'll both heal quickly and you'll be able to play with those grandkids sooner than you all thought you could. So, Frank, tell our audience just a little bit about maybe your history and interest in a unique area that many of us don't know much about, and that is in the area of strategically using technology and media to create disciples who create disciples and create movements. It's something you observed. It's something you've researched on. Give us that. You're a brilliant man, but give us that kindergarten overlay and view of what you've discovered and what you're up to your eyeballs and working with these days.
Well, thank you, Mike. That's awful generous introduction. I've been a missionary with Pioneers for about 28 years or so. In the beginning, my first 12 or so years was in Indonesia, where I was assigned to help do cassette tapes to help persuade people that they need to become Christians, using a lot of work by a guy named Vigo Sogard. Then we began to observe over periods of time that people weren't responding the way we thought, the way the theory had told us from Sogard and Engel and others, James Engel, who did the Engel scale, and they began responding differently. So we began to say, you know what? I think we're not. There's a lot more going on here with media than we actually are using well. So I wrote to our organization and said, I think we need to go back and relearn media theory and strategy so to use it in church planting different than what we had in the past. And so here I'm about 50 years old. For those of you who are popping up higher, our organization says, well, why don't you go and work on a PhD program studying how the intersection between media and churches and movements are going, church planting and movements. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is really a bad idea. I barely got out of high school. I'm like, it's not the sharpest crayon in the box. God, this is not a good idea. But I just felt God pressing me to do this. And so we applied to different schools and was accepted in Wisconsin to research how media and movements in Islam intersected. So we thought if we learn how Islamic movements start, then we can actually take those same principles and put them over to church planting. And soon after that, Homeland Security heard about what I was wanting to research. So they actually funded my whole education. And I found myself running with some pretty high-end researchers on identifying how media and Islam and movements. And cutting the short story, God taught us some very significant things. We published a lot of journal articles and the material that we developed in school is still being used by Homeland Security to train the people who are working in this type of sphere, but able to come out of that and apply these same kinds of principles over in the Christian media world. And the big finding was that media is terrible about persuading people to become believers, but it is good at identifying people who are open for religious change. So with that sentence in my mind, I go back and I reread the scriptures, and I find it popping up all over the place in the books of Acts, in Jesus' ministry, in Matthew 13, John 4, John 1. And so this principle of idea that media or any type of communication, broad-based communication, is better at identifying people than it is for persuading people. So that changes everything we go about doing, the way type of media we use and how we go about using it. And we went on and began developing this in articles and things. We ended up developing a group of us together who are thinking about this sort of thing, and we created a team called Media to Movements, Media to Lead to Church Planting Movements. And then we had a team in North Africa who began applying it, and we began applying in Indonesia and saw God just do tremendous things there. So it's pretty exciting work. So
Absolutely.
that's a fast bill. If you want to look up more, it's on media to movements with a T on it, movements.org. You can see a lot of the history of that there.
Great. And so again, for our audience to understand, Frank, it's the fact that God has given us media. It was television, it was film, but now with social media, these are ways to catch and to filter those people who are really asking those life-changing questions, those existential questions. Why me? Where is God? How do I have a purpose in my life? And then to connect them online and other ways, and then move them through a funnel process that then connects them with a disciple maker. Talk about once you identify, so media has this ability to identify seekers, identify people with those questions in their heart, sometimes doing it at 2 a.m. when their insomniac is hitting them and they're worried about life. Now you have them attention-wise. What happens then in the funnel and what you hope to do?
One good way to think about this is Samuel and Eli. When God was calling Samuel, God calls out Samuel, Samuel. He runs into Eli and says, "What do you want me to do?" And Eli says, "You've had too much pizza last night. You're here, listen to your sleep. Go back to bed. Talk to us in the morning." God spoke to him again, and he ran in and says, "Yes, Eli. Yes, Father. What would you like me to do?" And then after the third time, Eli says, "I tell you what, if you hear this voice again, say to it, 'Here I am, God. What do you want me to do?'" And then, and the third time God spoke, and it says all this occurred before Samuel knew the Lord. And so then Samuel says to him, "God, what do you want me to do?" And Eli only did was just guide Samuel on how to respond to God. Well, we know from research and everything else that there are tons of people out there, just like Eli and just like Samuel, who are feeling God's call, but they don't have any Elis to guide them. So we are only serving as an Eli to say, "Okay, for God, what you want me to do?" And we just don't try to persuade, but we try to help them know what it is to say or what to do at the time when God is calling them. Questions and spiritual questions, how to read, how do you go, and what Bible portions of the Bible would be good to read. And then eventually we want them to meet with a field worker to say, "What do you want me to do?" And they actually lead them to faith, baptize them, and get them involved in disciples who make disciples. The actually interesting thing about this is that when people are making great faith decisions in high-risk situations, going from Muslims to Christians, from Hindus to Christians, any other place like in China where it's a high-risk environment to make believers, people become believers with other people at the same time. In other words, it's not just an individualistic conversion experience, but it's a group conversion. So if you look at the book of Acts, of the 21 conversion experiences in the book of Acts, 19 of them are group oriented. Paul was one, the Ethiopian eunuch was a single individual, but all the rest of them are groups. So we have to change our paradigm of how conversion occurs to actually make it a group experience and actually helping people start house churches and house Bible studies instead of going and joining an existing house church. So we just help the field workers make these transitions from going straight for conversion to actually working toward group conversion.
If we're to back up just a little and living here in our own country, Lifeway says that in some research Tom Rainier and others did, that if you just, as a believer, invited someone to church, which is not helping them to convert to Christianity, but just in our context, inviting them to church, 70% of the people you would invite would say yes and come. You're saying now with media globally, what we have just heard is that, and you didn't say the percent, but correct me if I'm wrong, at any point, media and or of any kind of way of screening and identifying, there's 2% of a population, is that right? That is receptive to asking some kind of question of a serious spiritual nature.
At least 2.5%. In some conditions, in some situations, it's even higher. we're believing that probably that number is higher in the Islamic world right now. And we're finding response rates being across the charts.
So if we're in our own homeland, we can do just invitation. If we can't do that, but want to fulfill the Great Commission, harnessing and helping other people harness media and so forth to find the 2.5% is like that invitation of finding them and beginning to have the conversations. Then you're saying that what we see in high risk situations is it's got to be the group. It's always that way. I mean, when we play a team sport, we're always better than the parts, and two horses pull much more synergistically than if they did it independently. So also community. If a community, a family, some kind of group moves together, they have the ability to make a stronger decision against resistance, but they also, I hear you saying, are going to stick. They're going to be able to resist, be faithful, and it begin to multiply, right?
That's correct. Right. Yep.
So, my friends, listen to what my brother is saying, that God has given us tools like social media, has given us tools that can go ahead and do this very thing. Matthew 9:38, Luke 10:2 says, pray to the Lord of the harvest for what? More workers. You're affirming, and talk to us a little bit about it. I hear other colleagues of ours like John Rawls and others saying, Mike, over and over, I know that this is true because we have more seekers than we have disciple makers who can work in the harvest field. Talk to us a little bit about just some of the overwhelming impact that some of the strategies had in movements that you've seen happening from your chair.
I know in Indonesia, we're identifying over 100 people per month who are open for religious change, who are from the Islamic world. High numbers, and I got people that I know in other countries. I can't mention the names of them, but in the Middle East, we had a guy who went into looking for Syrian seekers in Beirut, and so the day once they arrived, they actually had Bible studies set up to start as they're unpacking their boxes for the first time. So currently in the world, there are about 1,400 church planting movements, which are over 1,000 house churches and one ethnic group within a certain amount of years. And those are ones what we call level 5 house church planting movements. There's another 1,000 that are almost at the brink of actually doing this, making this number. There's about 750 million new believers in the unreached people world who have become believers in the last 10 years. We can document that.
I hope they're getting encouraged, Frank, by what you're saying. I mean, we feel with a pandemic, and this is what we're going to go to in a minute. We feel in a pandemic like, wow, we couldn't gather as a church. Wow, there's such economic turmoil. Directionalists, pastors are thinking of retiring and resigning and leaving the ministry. And yet you're telling us that around the world, in very tough situations where they've lived with a persecuted kind of pandemic 24/7 for decades, that there's fruitfulness, there's coming a life out of the desert. And I hope that encourages our listeners today, because I know it always encourages when I hear that from you. Thousands of churches, that there's 1,400 movements of 1,000 plus churches at the level 5 and others and even getting more mature in there. Tell us where you think the Spirit is moving, some of the hot points of the church growth today. Where would they be for our listeners?
There's a really good book called The Marxism Movement by Winfield Bivens, Bevins, and he really marks us out of the Wesleyan movement that happened in 1700. The conditions for that type of time frame is about the same as it is now. And part of the growth that came from the early Wesleyan movement, and then which actually came to the Baptist movement and other movements at the time, was moving away from organizational buildings to actually house churches. And so our current situation, since people now have gone into the pandemic, they have moved into their close circles more so than they ever had before, because we had our quote unquote bubbles. That means these are people who are ripe for really understanding authentic Christianity from their bubble, from their own small unit, than they are to going to a large building where they could probably get sick at. So they're moving back to a singular sort of house church idea. So I think that's where we're going. We're going to have to think about how we reconfigure church in the U.S. to not something that's actually go to, but actually in your community. And that's a Luke 10:2 principle. When Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but laborers, if you pray that the Lord of the harvest will send forth laborers in a harvest, the key phrase that comes out of that is from the harvest will come the harvesters. So no longer will the professional workers be the harvesters, but it's going to be the individual who is running his own house church movement. So we have to think about how to train lay leaders to become leaders in their own house churches, and then kind of put that together to become the church of Ephesus, even though it was about 10 or so house churches.
I love the word you're saying with a bubble, the element that it was an attractional model, the element that even now words mean things. And we say, oh, the church has been closed. We are the church. The church has never been closed anywhere in the world, US or anywhere. It's a building space that houses the church during corporate worship may have been closed or challenged, but getting it, dispersed into the community, neighborhoods. Yep. And sounds a little bit like, talk to us a little bit like in the book of Acts, when they kind of had the major huddle in Jerusalem, and then something happened, and what happened there, you know?
Right. It's exactly when you look at the book of Acts and where Paul goes and communicates that thousands are coming to faith, he has actually mentioned there that the Greek word is actually tens of thousands. There's more church believers in the Greek community than was in the Jerusalem community. And so the Jerusalem church was impressed by that growth. So yes, the church is growing exponentially outside of our organized church environment. So we have to figure out how we can help people put structures together. We call them trellises together, so that the house church movement can grow and expand to others. So some of us are starting to think about how we can do this in the U.S., and we still in that conversation.
So trellis, for those who won't know, I have one in my backyard, is where you have either grapevines or you have flowering plants that kind of grow up and in it, and they fill in the lattice work. It gives it some structure and stability, and then it gives them the opportunity for life and for spreading and growth to happen. So two things. Our time is going really fast. One is with what is happening, what else would you like to encourage our listeners, with most of us being as listeners from the U.S. marketplace and community right now? What would you encourage us to be the takeaway from COVID?
For me, I think it's a time for us to rethink how disciples make disciples. It's not done by the professional up front, but we ourselves make disciples of those around us. And disciples don't necessarily have to be someone who can do named all the 66 books of the Bible and the tenets of faith. It's how they can learn to have an experience with God. Disciples not a position obtained, but it's a relationship maintained. So how can we help people have a maintaining, persistent relationship? So I think the big challenge for us is, how do we rethink church in a modern age? That's what Wesley was challenged with. How can I rethink church in a time when it was had moved into that new era in the 1700s?
And so we have the book of Acts showing us that. We have research and historical perspective, like you just cited with Wesley. Closing off is going back to this lattice work is getting developed and is very organic globally. Where are those points that, hey, we think it's tough? Whoever they are, as a community, as an unreached people group, an XYZ country, they're having a pandemic overlay with persecution, with poverty, and yet the church is growing and disciples are being made that make disciples. If they can do it, we can do it. So book of Acts, history, we got global community people now being able to do it in even tougher decisions. Surely we in America can buck up and do that. Where would you say, put your eyes on these modern day movement groups? What countries, what people groups are you seeing having some experiential movement of God and growth right
now? Most of the Islamic world, heavily in the Hindu world, and the growth is just astounding there. But those are the two major. Sub-Saharan Africa, among Somalis, among Kenyans, things like that. That's another growth area. So the growth is happening in what we have been called the global South, substantially so.
So I hope you heard from my brother Frank about the amount of numbers of movements, again, the 1,400, the number of churches per movement, documenting all of that. It's happening with people that don't have high education, don't have resources, don't have a lot of building and equity of that, and yet they have a lattice work of relationships and, like you said, community that's causing them to grow and to maintain and to be strong. Any closing words, my good friend, as we again wish you well and healing and so forth, that you would give to our viewers in this season, right now, where they're at, wondering about what is God doing in my life, community, country, and world.
I think we just have to go back and rediscover what does it mean to be a disciple that makes disciples. We have forgotten that. We may be churchgoers or church growers, but we're not disciples.
And I'd agree. And I tell people all the time, we all know how to make disciples. I, as a parent, have a son who talks like me, walks like me, likes some of the same food. He's imitated me, disciple making. I love the St. Louis Cardinals. I have a daughter who loves the St. Louis Cardinals. I can make fans. I can make other people like an iPhone over an Android or whatever. We're all disciples of something and making people disciples of something, but we surely know how to do it in the organic sense of life. Surely we can do it regarding the most important element of who we follow eternally, and that is Jesus. Frank Preston, thank you for some of your valuable time. Again, all of us here at GNPI are indebted to you for your help and leadership with us, connecting us to lots of people. We friends are trying to put into practice a lot of what our brother Frank has researched and is practicing today along with his colleagues. So thank you. Also wishing you well in your reparative state of one surgery down and heal that, and the other one to come, and that healing as well. So thank you, Frank Preston. Thank you for listening today. If it's been of an encouraging time, please share it on social media channels. It probably would encourage somebody else. We do have an audio podcast version as well. So from all of us here at GNPI in Joplin, Missouri, my brother Frank Preston, wishing you a great day. Please, my friends, let your faith be greater than fear. There's somebody you can bless today. Till next time, have a great one.